Hi folks, I'm Bryan. I'm one of the co-founders and CTO here at Zapier. And today I want to talk about thinking with an automation mindset. Now, automation's a big part of our lives at Zapier. We spent a lot of time not only building a product centered around automation, but also doing a lot of automation ourselves. So we've learned a couple tricks and a couple ways to really accelerate and amplify automation and how to approach automation that I think you'll find pretty useful. So let's real quick get into what we'll talk about today. So what is an automation mindset? What is it we're trying to do? And this will just kind of define kind of our goals for today. Next, we'll really get into developing that automation mindset. And here I'm going to try to provide you with a couple of high value automation models to kind of find the scenarios to apply automation to. We're going to get into the habits of automation. So how are you going to get that put in place? What's the kind of habits you can create and develop to really, take those scenarios and actually put automation in place for those? And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some examples, some anecdotes that really help you, understand how you might want to advocate for automation inside of your organization. All right, let's start at an automation mindset. So what is it that we're talking about here? And really, automation mindset's pretty simple. It's when do you reach for automation? Is it after something? Is it a reactive thing that you reach for when something breaks, when something goes a little haywire, someone leaves and the process is kind of lost? Or is it something you do proactively ahead of time? So, someone with that automation mindset is going to be thinking about and searching for scenarios to bring automation in to make, operations smoother, to accelerate growth, to just find opportunities, make things more repeatable, more reliable, and more effective. And really, you're just looking for kind of this idea of automation first rather than automation last. And that's really automation mindset in a nutshell. And we're going to really get into some of the ways to develop that automation mindset, which will help you kind of find some of those scenarios to kind of apply that to. So these will be things that you'll want to be thinking about, like triggering that automation mindset, kind of like little reminders to tell you like, oh yeah, that is something that could be a great place for automation. So first up are these three qualities. So I'm going to pause and we're just going to go into each one of these one at a time, because each of these really kind of define the scenarios and the kind of qualities of different work streams that you might want to automate. First up is anything repetitive. And I know we've all had work kind of like this, where you're copy pasting stuff, or it's mind numbing checking things, and it's either data entry or juggling tabs. And for me, a lot of times it's something in SaaS software where I'm going to one tab, checking this, going to this one, finding that thing and matching it up, and maybe doing a link back and forth. And I'm just finding myself doing something over and over again. So that's like the first clue to tell you or someone on your team, like, okay, this is super repetitive, right? This is something that a machine might be able to do more effectively than a human, right? So that's the first thing to be really looking for, is anything repetitive, anything that you're doing over and over again with very similar steps. The next one is fragile. So, these are things where the cost of a mistake is not insignificant, but it's really likely that, one small mistake could amplify into a larger mistake. And for me, that's, anything where you got a typo and it's the wrong category now, or, you misclick the wrong thing in that repetitive process. You have to coordinate this change with that change at the same time. Sometimes you'll break out a checklist, right, to make sure that the right things happen in the right order, because you want to avoid forgotten steps. And fragility is just this, property that makes a workflow that a human is doing much more likely to develop an error or develop some sort of issue with the workflow. So that's the second thing to really look for, is like, is it error prone? Is it fragile? Is it something that, when a human's involved and makes a tiny mistake, it kind of sneaks through and causes issues downstream? So that's the second one. And the third one is timeliness. So This one I think is kind of the automation superpower, and one that I really like to highlight because automation never sleeps. People, we got to sleep. At least science hasn't figured that one out. So as this instant response aspect comes into play and makes that process more valuable, because the sooner you can get to that customer or to that employee or answer that question, the higher the value is of actually performing that task, the more automation can really drive that process and make it a much more effective process. Because if the customer gets an answer 2 days later when you finally get around to it, that's going to be a much poorer experience than an instant response that says, hey, check out this thing. Oftentimes customers have questions about this, check that out, like kind of the autoresponder sort of a thing, or progressing a workflow just immediately as soon as it happens, that instant response. So that's the last thing I really coach people on, is looking at this timeliness factor. So 1, 2, 3, repetitive, fragile, and timely are the 3 scenarios you really want to be looking for to find those things that automate them. Next up, I want to talk about what I generally call like the primary colors of automation. So these are the things that you might bring to one of those scenarios if you're not really sure where to exactly start. Because sometimes, these automation workflows you're not really sure which end to start at, like how big to make it. And I always like to highlight these 3 as key ingredients for this. So the first one is really about form-based triggers. So there's tons of solutions out there for this. We have things like Typeform and Gravity Forms and Google Forms and Jot Forms. There's a bunch out there, but at the core, they let you, add some fields and customize it. Ask for a first name, last name, email address. You can pick a date on a date form and fill out a blob of text, whatever it happens to be. You can customize that, and that's really for a human to kickstart an automation, right? Sometimes you want to kickstart because of some action that happened in some sort of some app that you have, some SaaS software that you have. But sometimes it's actually a person, it's a customer, it's someone inside of your org that needs to kick off a workflow. So that's a really good one to just kind of look for those human points to kick off a workflow. The next one is sheet-based coordination. So I like to think of this as like any of that kind of weird ad hoc data that you might have that's part of your workflow, but doesn't really sit in any software that you have currently. That could be like, a purchase order for a new work or new kind of process you have internal, or it might be kind of a new product that you're trying to sell, but you haven't kind of integrated that with your CRM yet, or who knows, right? But it's just kind of this ad hoc data that you want to add it to a spreadsheet and look it up somewhere else. And it really helps you kind of coordinate more complex flows as you start to add things in. So things like Google Sheets, Airtable, Smartsheet, lots of solutions out there, but all serving that same purpose within a workflow is to kind of stash data, pull that data out, and potentially like remix and reuse across multiple automations. So that's the second one. And the final one is to kind of push it back into kind of the sphere of human interaction. So this is kind of what I talk about as to-do based actions. So it kind of takes something that's happening in your workflow automatically, and then puts it back into the sphere of a human picking it up and completing a task. So this is often something that you're going to find with software like Jira. Maybe you use Asana or Trello, or even a personal to-do list like Todoist. And that's going to help you kind of close that loop. So lots of automated things, maybe pulling information from this thing, from that thing, kind of rolling it up and then dropping it with like a really rich task so that person knows exactly what to do and they don't have to go looking for that data. So you can use these in all kinds of different ways and remix them from customer-facing workflows to internal-facing workflows, kind of stitching together data that might be in some SaaS software, or might be something you have to kind of collect yourself, and then finally getting it back into the inbox of a human that really needs to take action on it and kind of close out the loop. And kind of the pro tip here is with this to-do based action, at the very end, you could always include, another link to a different form to start the next workflow. So you can kind of string these things together and create really epic systems that really drive your business or drive your organization forward, and kind of bake automation in where it's appropriate and still engages with the humans and folks in your org in the meantime. So with that, I want to move on to talking about the habits of automation mindset. So once you've identified these scenarios, you kind of have a couple of the ingredients that you might use with it and a bit of an idea. These are the kinds of techniques, the tactics that you're going to use day to day, week to week, to really make this a part of your daily bread so that you can kind of bring automation into your organization and make it something that really drives some value inside. So first up, let's talk about starting small and iterating on a regular cadence. One of the biggest mistakes I see when people try to do automation is they want to automate all the things. And that can be just really complicated and really overwhelming. And there's this kind of moment of stiction where you're like, until I get it all figured out, I can't get started. And that's really an anti-pattern for automation, because you often don't know the requirements incomplete, and you don't know where you might want to go, and you might need to iterate in the future. So that extra work and that upfront work can be wasted, or worse, cause you not to even want to get started because it's just too much, right? So I always recommend starting with something really simple. So maybe if we went back to that primary, colors, ingredients, maybe it's just a form that you put on your website for customers to ask for more details about a new product. Or maybe it's a request appointment form that you put on your website, or maybe something internally to trigger, IT purchases. Who knows? But that's just a form. You wire it in, and then you drop that task into the place that you might want someone to actually pick up on it. So maybe that's dropping into, their to-do list, or maybe into a Slack room or something like that. Just a very simple 2-step Zap. But as you get more comfortable with it, you can start to add more steps. Maybe you sneak in another step that adds something to a spreadsheet, so you have like a permanent record of that thing. Maybe you add another Zap that watches that and then follows up on it with a delay. 15 days later, we'll check in and make sure that that was, satisfactorily resolved, right? Now, you didn't think about all that stuff right up front. You kind of feathered it in as you got more used to it. And that is something that can make it a much more progressive enhancement over time. And you don't really have to, solve everything right out the get-go. And another tip that I would recommend is, as you start to accumulate more and more Zaps, more and more of these workflows, just start naming them in a particular way. Start organizing them into folders, because that'll really help you sort of make sense of the various automations you have as they get more complex and they start to interact with each other in more complex ways. So again, start small, just 1 or 2 steps in a Zap, and then add more as you get more comfortable with it, right? You can clone Zaps, you can pause them, restart them. So you really have a ton of flexibility on how you want to approach that. Next up is really to start, having yourself ask how, not who. Now, if you're like me, a lot of the way you were thinking about stuff was often someone on the team helping out to solve some sort of problem. Maybe Janet or Larry, they'll be the ones that kind of take care of this. And you get to delegate some of that stuff, or you get to like bounce it across your team. This exercise requires you think maybe just a step further as to like, well, what would it literally take to do that thing? So instead of like, hey, yeah, have Janet take care of this, you might say, okay, so Janet would probably log into this app, maybe look for anything that's new, add it to the spreadsheet and go back. So you're kind of breaking down these discrete steps. And now you can really kind of bring that into automation or a workflow in a more discrete manner. So, and the more you get used to doing this, the more your knowledge of different tools you have at your disposal can be applied to this, and the more kind of like clearly you can articulate this. So again, back to that first step, if you can't like figure out all the steps, just figure out 2 really quick ones that you think could work and get started with that. And then you can still have that person behind the scenes interacting with it, with either filling out that form or handling that, to-do task on their side. So the, pro-human aspect of automation is kind of starting with this kind of deconstructing of the work of humans so that you can kind of augment it in an automated fashion. And it kind of starts at asking how and not exactly who. Next up is really educating the team and kind of spreading this mindset. So these tips and the following tips you're going to get, like those are the things that you want to bring to your team and get in front of them, because you don't want to be that one person that knows all the things about automation, right? And you're going to be limited by what insight you have into how things get done, right? So you really need their help. So this is really an effective way we found to drive automation, kind of this culture of automation deep into an organization. And if you do it well, the whole team's going to be like looking for these opportunities, building on them, adding kind of ways to get more leverage versus strictly being at that keyboard doing that stuff individually. And we got a couple examples on how you can do that coming up. But needless to say, it's really, not putting it all on yourself and being, the automation guru soul, but really kind of seeing your role as taking your mindset and spreading that throughout the team so you have backup and you have support of doing this stuff well. One technique I like to suggest for that education aspect is to create a bit of a cadence. So if you have team meetings, you probably discuss strategy about all kinds of things, interacting with customers, getting through more of the workload, doing estimation, all kinds of stuff. But one thing you should add to the agenda for your meetings is just talking about automation strategy, right? This is where you get to highlight example automations that you've done in the past, and also ask teams to be thinking of new ones, right? New areas, right, for automation. Asking questions like, where's everybody spending their time? Where are the mistakes happening? Going back to those scenarios of, fragility, of having fragility issues, and all these other kind of scenarios, and kind of picking those out, identifying the scenarios, and then really applying these sort of aspects of habits to them. So the last kind of tip I always bring up there is to reiterate what this can add to your team rather than what this takes away, because oftentimes this can be something that's a little scary. Automation comes in and starting to do work for people, and do we need people? There's this kind of like tension that is created, and you can actually really directly address that by highlighting the kinds of things you're able to do because automation exists. So a great example is, what leverage are you getting now that this task is highly automated? That person's freed up to do other stuff. So instead of Larry doing all this work to get applicants into the process, that applicant process is automated now, and now we can do programs to educate those applicants. A much higher value, much more leveraged action that isn't as much toil, isn't as much kind of like fragile work baked into it. Just makes it much more effective. So highlighting that can really bring to bear kind of the value that automation can bring without it kind of being this spooky, taking my job kind of feel. So balancing that when you're having these discussions is a really key practice. Next up, I always ask for people to take a breath and think about budgeting time and money up front for automation. And I think the value of this is really to set expectations, especially when this is a process. Automation is a process. It's not something that's just going to be dropped in and set up right away. It's going to take some time to configure upfront. It might initially under deliver. So sometimes folks just are very skeptical about automation. So that's one challenge. But sometimes folks are a little too bullish about what automation can do. It's not artificial intelligence. It's not Skynet. So you still have to kind of temper those expectations on both sides, kind of clamp them down. One thing I do recommend folks try to do, create a habit out of, is to compare and contrast to a human manually doing the work, right? And in that, you want to account for the human error of the kind of task, the risk of like that person leaving and kind of having a gap, but also where they might be better, right? Making subjective decisions about the workflow itself. Because if you have that mindset in place and you have these habits in place, then you can start to apply automation in the right spots, and you don't have to like overdo it, and you won't underdo it either. And then of course, automation takes time, which is money, but also the resources for paying for software is often not insignificant. So just having that in there so that folks are aware of what to expect is really valuable. The one thing to really avoid here is the kind of automation that works so well that people forget about it. That'll happen, but what you can do here is bring it back to kind of some visibility, right? It's easy for this work to be taken for granted, but if you kind of set this expectation up, and we'll get into some examples on how you can kind of show off the kind of automation work you're doing, it prevents it from being taken for granted for too much, because there's some value in it. It took some work to get set up, and it's running and it's doing its job. Oftentimes that can get a little invisible over time just because it's working in the background. And if it ain't broke, you don't fix it unless people pay attention to it. So that's just something that I always like to call out here, especially as we move on to the next slide. This one's really about having winning anecdotes in your back pocket. You could call these examples, you can call these anecdotes. This helps to justify automation, especially in that it just happened magic behind the scenes where people don't see the effort and the kind of value that it's bringing to bear because it just sort of works. But it also really helps communicate the value that automation creates, as well as like a great education moment, right? I always recommend having two examples in your back pocket here. The first one is really hyper focused on customer automation, and the second one is really hyper focused on kind of the back office automation. And there's two kind of like facets of this that we see Zapier used a ton. So on the customer automation front, this could be everything from managing leads to helping accelerate sales, to handling customer support, you name it. And back office can be everything from hiring to IT or procurement or any of these sorts of things that kind of happen internally for your org. And different folks in your org are going to care about different ones. And being able to like articulate what it is automation does for you in this context is really, really valuable. So before we kind of wrap up, I do want to show a couple examples to just give you an idea of what those anecdotes are, right? The first one is going to be very much a customer automation example. And I want to highlight a really cool group out of Sydney called the Black Ties. They're a magician group, right? And it's just a couple of gentlemen that are working and running that. And they started their org manually managing their inbound lead and inbound interest, right? And they were doing a ton of this. So they were using stuff like, Squarespace to submitting a form to getting an email. They were, manually creating cards in Trello and deals in pipeline, trying to just build out, a sophisticated pipeline for building their business. But they were doing this all manually. So once they added something like Zapier and started to automate those pieces, they grew that by 5x to 1,000 leads a year they handle. And they actually spend less time on it now than they did when it was much smaller, right? And what I think Julian was the person who was doing a lot of this work, also a magician, was able to develop more programs, able to engage with customers much on live gigs, and just build a better business because he wasn't stuck doing all of the kind of like manual kind of toil of just getting people through the onboarding and the kind of funnel on their side. So this one I think is a great example because it highlights automation's role in growth, and it kind of is a reminder of how automation can supplement the time that a human would spend and kind of free them up for something else, which I thought was a really cool example. So his talents, instead of responding to email or watching a form get submitted, are being spent on customers developing the product that the customers love, which I think is a fantastic example of a customer automation example. Next up, I thought this one was really cool. This is more of a back office automation example. And it's from this gym, a climbing gym called the Pad Climbing. And they really used Zapier to automate their screening process for new hires. And they had a couple really cool tricks. One was job posts would include kind of a code word like, hey, mention this when you apply, because to them, that really indicated that this was a really engaged applicant. And that would kind of get past like the first stage. The next thing that they would do is actually have a competency test, which they could submit to the candidate automatically and get evaluated automatically to kind of jump past the next one. And as you can imagine, a climbing gym, you want people working there that know a little bit about safety and these sorts of things. So that, again, raised the kind of quality bar for their applicants by quite a bit. So in the end, they got way higher quality applicants, and the hiring manager got to spend time only on those quality applicants, and their workforce ended up being a better, more trained, and more prepared workforce to help with their customers and kind of grow their business. So the reason I think this is a great example is because it kind of highlights on that back office aspect, but it really focuses on something different than kind of the revenue aspect or kind of growth aspect, and really focuses on the quality aspect. And it is a great example of where there's this clean handoff between people. So someone submits, they get kind of a response back. They start off with their competency test, it comes back. And then once they pass all that, that's when the hiring manager comes in. And humans are still deeply involved, but they're not kind of doing the kind of toil, kind of the manual aspect of it. It's much cleaner process. So it kind of balances that. And I thought that was a really great example. So again, two examples, one customer, one back office. So
With that, I want to do a real quick summary. The automation mindset is just about being proactive versus reactive when you're looking for scenarios to deploy automation into. You really want to be searching for those three kind of repetitive, fragile, and timely scenarios to see where might you want to deploy automation. And if you're not exactly sure where to start, I always recommend forms to kind of gather that input and kick off a workflow from a person, whether that be a customer or an employee internally or an applicant or you name it. Some sort of a sheets to kind of fill in the gaps, because there's always like little pieces that don't fit quite into the software you use. And then some sort of to-do action task-based thing at the very end to get it back into the human sphere to kind of wrap up. Those are often good spots to start. That pairs well with this idea of like starting small, iterating, right? These kind of habits that you want to use to build the automations, asking how and not who, right? Thinking about breaking down the tasks rather than handing off the tasks, educating the team, bringing them into the process. So it's not just you looking for these, creating a cadence to have these conversations, budgeting that time and that money, setting those expectations, both of what automation can do and can't do and what to expect on that front. And then also having those anecdotes ready, so that when folks are like, hey, what is this automation thing that we're spending all this time on, and I was doing stuff that I don't understand, you can really kind of provide the background of that value it's creating. So with that, go forth and automate. Really appreciate you spending time with us today. Thank you. Always feel free to reach out to me, Bryan@Zapier.com, or on Twitter as well. And of course, our great support team would be happy to help you out with any of this stuff too. So thank you and have a good day.